Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the North Carolina Botanical Garden and this special lecture tonight with a focus on Arbor Day, as well as the 120th anniversary of Coker Arboretum. We're grateful to have Dr. Peter White here with us this evening. What a special opportunity for us. I'm Joanna Massey-Lalikas. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Garden. And in the back of the room, we have David Michaud, who is assisting on the Zoom with our live online audience. So we have folks tuning in from North Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, and Tennessee. We welcome everybody. So with that, I'd like to invite our Director of Horticulture, Dan Stern, to share more about tonight's lecture and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Joanna. And I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you all for joining us on the eve of Arbor Day. I also wanted to sort of connect the dots to why we're celebrating trees and invite you all to sort of think of some other ways to incorporate trees into your lives at home. We have provided a list of trees that we recommend for the Piedmont of North Carolina on the chair over there by the door that you came in. And we have a small selection available on the daily plant sale, which you could pick up while you're here today. I'd also encourage you all to get up and visit the Coker Arboretum. As Joanna mentioned, it's celebrating its 120th anniversary this year. And that's really something to cherish, a 5-acre green oasis in the middle of Chapel Hill, really dedicated to showing off the best trees of the southeastern U.S. Take that and Arbor Day forward with you. Again, I want to turn the attention to our speaker tonight, Peter White. Peter's admiration and respect for trees began with boyhood summers on a Maine lake. He received a BA from Bennington College in 1971 and a PhD in ecology from Dartmouth College in 1976. As a grad student, he also served as the tree warden of Hanover, New Hampshire. After a postdoctoral year at the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis, he served as a research biologist for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 8 years, and then moved here to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for a joint position as a professor in the biology department and the director of the North Carolina Botanical Garden. Under Peter's leadership, North Carolina Botanical Garden first coined the phrase a conservation garden, and also started to really nurture an organizational commitment to sustainability. We also, under Peter's leadership, developed some tenets that continue to this day to demonstrate real leadership in our industry, such as a conservation through propagation and a policy regarding our own treatment of non-native invasive species. Peter also led the Botanical Garden through a period of tremendous growth, including the construction of the Allen Education Center that we're in today, as well as the gardens that surround it, and expanding the staff to take care of the gardens and build out the programming of the North Carolina Botanical Garden. Peter retired from the directorship of the North Carolina Botanical Garden in 2014 and from teaching at the university in 2019. He and his students and collaborators published several hundred scientific papers in ecology and conservation. Previous books include Wildflowers of the Smokies and the Ecology of Natural Disturbance and Patch Dynamics. Peter, more recently, is a co-author of the recently published book, World Atlas of Trees and Forests, available for purchase and signing at the conclusion of the talk tonight over in the gift shop. And this book, which I've had the pleasure of consuming quite a bit of, has gotten a lot of accolades recently, including winner of the Dartmouth Medal for Outstanding Reference Work from the American Library Association, and winner of the PROSE Award in Environmental Science from the Association of American Publishers. So, Peter, we're very honored to have you tonight, and I hope you all will join me in welcoming Peter.
All right. I have to confess one thing, which is I can't resist thinking of this as a staff meeting. I'm not sure what the agenda is, but I'm tempted to welcome you to the staff meeting of the North Carolina Botanical Garden. Well, I wanted to talk about trees. This is going to be sort of a general overview of what's exciting to me about trees. Some of it contained in the book in question. What I really like about this book is that it turned into not only a picture book about trees and forests, but also incorporated scientific stories and some, not just research from the past, but new research and new questions that are being asked about trees and forests. So it was that combination that I think is the significance of the book to me. And from that book, I hope you, like my students here at the Highlands Biological Station, end up hugging trees. So for each page of the book, I think there are 440 pages. That's the number of hugs that you now owe the world. It's a celebration too, and pointing towards the real issues of conservation that we face in today's world. It's fun that it's been successful so far. It's being translated into French and German. And we'll see if the Chinese edition also materializes. Well, trees were my first enthusiasm in botany. And in doing this talk, I asked myself, you know, why were trees my first enthusiasm? And I think it's the sense that trees exhibit patience and endurance, that they integrate across years of variation in the environment, that they are the frame of nature reflecting on both the environment and the history of a particular site. They're the visible manifestation of the endurance of nature itself. We think of trees, and one of the things people always want to know are the extremes. So the most massive tree, a giant sequoia, 16 times the weight of a blue whale, which is the largest animal ever to have existed. The tallest, the coast redwood, at 115.92 meters, taller than the Statue of Liberty. The one with the greatest diameter, the Monterey cypress, in a location in Mexico, 11 meters across. And the largest tree crown above is a eucalyptus of 73 meters across. So the size and the age matter to us. A recent paper did a survey of the oldest trees on Earth, documented trees, and found that there were 29 individuals of 10 species that were over 2,000 years of age. And interestingly enough, even though this is the era of flowering plants, gymnosperms accounted for 28 of those 29 trees older than 2,000 years. This is a list of the top 6. And you can see that the last one there, Taxodium dissicum, is here in North Carolina. The largest angiosperm is a baobab tree, or the oldest angiosperm tree is a baobab. Whoops. Here we go. Somehow we'll make this work. How many of you have been to the Black River site of the 6th oldest tree in the world, a bald cypress? It's the 6th oldest if you count by kinds of tree. If you allow for multiple redwoods and sequoias and other trees, it's the 14th oldest documented tree on Earth. The king of Babylon in 601 was ruling at the time of the birth of this tree. So a little more about old trees. This slide shows in the upper left that gymnosperms among the record trees are older than the flowering plants, as you can see. Also, interestingly, there's very little relationship between the maximum tree height and its age. The tallest trees aren't always the oldest. In fact, the oldest often occur in places where trees grow slowly, in mountains with not with the highest productivity, but cold, rocky, and less fertile sites. And there are really 2 clusters of very old trees on Earth. One is in the Pacific, in the northwest of North America, and the other is in Western China. And both of these places are places with summer drought, winter rain, and very slow growing trees, reaching these extended ages. Well, that was all for single stemmed trees, but also some trees are clonal. And so there's a very large clone of quaking aspen called the Pando aspen in Utah. It's a clone made up of 47,000 individual stems. Each of those is only reaches about 130 years of age, but the whole clone is about 14,000 years old. 6 times heavier in aggregate than the giant sequoia and covering 108 acres. Dormant seeds and tissues of plants can be even older. Seeds from under melting glacial ice that are estimated to be 40,000 years old have been experimentally germinated. And in thinking of trees as representing endurance and patience and integrating across environments, of course, I have to immediately qualify that with the rapid environmental change of today's world, leading to forests that have been called ghost forests, sudden and extensive death in the forest. The upper left, the sea level rise, storm, and saltwater damage to forests in North Carolina, the fires of the American Southwest, and the recent death of hemlock under the invasion of the hemlock woolly adelgid invader from Asia. Well, a little bit more about this first love of mine, trees. It did happen on the shore of a pond in Maine. And before, in my young years there, the Maine world was this wonderful, beautiful haze of green. And the 2 or 3 or 4 weeks I was able to spend up there every summer seemed much longer than the 11 months of the rest of the year and the school year. It was always Maine occupying most of that calendar to me. But the trees were just a haze of green. When I was 20 years old and in between sophomore and junior year of college, I was pre-med, but it wasn't really that I ever had any real interest in medicine. I think it was mostly my mother's love-hate relationship with doctors that meant that she was expecting me to go that route. But I picked up my grandfather's tree identification book, the Field Book of American Trees and Shrubs by Matthews. And that summer, things just became clear that haze of green consisted of individual species of trees that could be identified. I mean, sounds so simple, but at the time it was astounding to me that this knowledge existed and these different kinds of trees existed. Of course, that led to entering into the whole world of describing shapes, arrangements, designs in trees. Some of you have probably taken classes here and taken a quiz based on diagrams like this. I found that drawing was really important to getting to know the species around that lake. And my journals from the time are filled with drawings like these. There's nothing like trying to draw the shape of a leaf or the venation, or in this case, the catkins of the alder on the left, until you sit down and try to actually draw it. It's an amazing way to learn things. Well, the other big lesson I had, which was astounding to me, was that if you went from one part of the landscape to another, you saw different trees. Each tree had its own set of conditions that were ideal. And particularly the big change was elevation. As you go up the higher mountains in Maine and New Hampshire, you enter a zone that's dominated by spruce and fir trees. That's the dark green. This particular mountain is tall enough to have a tree line and to have an alpine zone above, showing in the gray. But again, I know this sounds kind of simplistic, but it was just an astounding observation to me that different species were adapted to different conditions and would show up. Maybe another example from the northern mountains is this bog that we can see from the top of a cliff face here. And you can see that ring of yellow. That's the exact condition of soil and acidity that is where the American larch tree grows. That's a deciduous needle-leaved tree. Doesn't occur in North Carolina. It has also upright cones that have this wonderful rosy color in the spring and then stay upright as they release seeds later in the year. Okay, so being able to resolve the shapes of leaves and use those to identify and find names for plants. The idea that if you change habitat, you change the species around you, and the trees had different habitats that they called home. The third observation that year was that the trees had, in a way, different life histories and different personalities. For example, sugar maple and beech, which are circled here, those two trees are long-lived. They produce a very dense wood. They're very shade tolerant. And they have a very slow lifestyle. They accumulate over the years through the changes in the landscape and have the oldest lifespans of this group. On the other hand, at the opposite extreme is gray birch, a short-lived tree reaching at most 40 years of age, low density wood, and shade intolerant. So fast-growing things often reproduce earlier in life. So we have, in other words, a set of life history traits here that are correlated that also help explain this variation in the trees around that lake. Those correlations include a correlation between seed size and seed number. If you make small seeds, you can often have really huge seed crop sizes. And as growth rates increase, things that are fast growing have low density wood. They often have a short age to reproductive maturity, and they have short lifespans. So in a way, what I was learning was that these trees show a spectrum of behaviors. On the one hand, you have sort of like the tortoise and the hare. You have things that live fast and jump in to colonize recently disturbed patches and have short lifespans. And then you have other trees which are slow to colonize, but have a greater longevity. This idea of the excitement of trees in terms of their personalities. Another book that I encountered in those years was Donald Colross-Petey's Natural History of Trees. Anybody ever seen that book? What I loved about that book was that it made every tree sound like the most incredible member of the flowering world or the tree world. Under white pine, perhaps no other tree in the world has had so momentous a career. Certainly no other has played so great a role in the life and history of the American people. Fleets were built to its great stands and railroads bent to them. It created mushroom fortunes, mushroom cities. Earlier, it was a torch in the hands of American liberty, though now it has fallen dramatically in terms of the old growth being gone from its high estate to a modest place among the other conifers. It's a saga worth retelling and then recalling. And then that goes on for about 8 pages of description. I wanted to prove to you that this book can make any tree sound important. So I randomly opened the book. It happened to be for shadblow or shadbush, or also called sarrisberry. In early spring, when the shad run, according to tradition, shadblow bursts into flower upon the naked wood before the leaves appear, or when the foliage is still just budding out and covered with silvery down. The contrast then of the long, delicate white petals with the bright red of the scales that hang down from the flower stalks is vivid, and no daintier flowers than these in their season, star of the forest aisles. So another book of those days was this one by Harlow, and he showed an illustration where he had picked bur oak leaves, he wanted to show that they were variable in shape. These all come from a single tree. And those of you that know me, probably, or maybe it's only Carolyn who knows this, but basically this one picture led to a lifetime of putting leaves on the ground and taking pictures. So here I am in Denmark. I went to visit colleagues there and give speeches, and I'm making a leaf mosaic out of the leaves that dominated a beechwood in Denmark. You'll see more of these pictures as we go on. In fall color, it's a perfect time. These are all from one tree to do a leaf picture. Well, okay, so the rest of this talk has these ambitions. One, to define tree. What are we talking about? To tell you about two patterns of tree diversity. And then I hope if there's time, we'll give an example of the ecological variety of trees with example from leaves, stems, bark, roots, and seeds. Well, the first important fact is that tree is not a taxonomic category, but rather a growth form. The tree form has evolved multiple times in the plant kingdom. It has arisen 38 independent times in one estimate. In other words, it's sort of convergent evolution to create tree forms from non-tree ancestors, and it's happened repeatedly. This means also that the nearest relatives of some trees are herbs, and some trees have descended from herbaceous ancestors and vice versa. So mulberries are more closely related to nettles, horse chestnut to broccoli, the sacred lotus to sycamore, than those trees are to each other in the tree world. So defining a tree from its growth form uses four possible characteristics. One is that a tree is single stemmed. Another is that it has perennial growth from meristems that are held at some distance above the ground, although that's an arbitrary distance, often set at 2 meters to define what is a tree. And these meristems are what makes a banana tree a giant herb and not a tree. That is to say that a banana tree's growing points are at the base of that tree-like structure. Self-supporting. This rules out tall vines, but what about strangler figs? And I'll illustrate those in a minute. And having secondary thickening, that is the lateral meristem that produces tree rings, is sometimes also used as a characteristic. So in the book, we present you with this, you can choose either a broad or a narrow definition of tree. So this circle is the monopodial trees, and those are single stemmed. And you can see that that includes palm trees, tree ferns, stranglers, again, a little bit in a minute, and then trees in the strictest sense. Here is a strangler fig. A strangler fig is a kind of fig that is able to start growing in the crown of another tree as an epiphyte, and then sends roots down the side of the trunk of that tree. And meanwhile, it's shading the tree. It's also sometimes compressing the lateral meristems of the host tree. And that tree can die and then rot away, and you end up with a fig tree where there once was a different kind of tree. So that's a strangler fig. All right, well, if we use self-supporting, then we've ruled out the strangler figs. And we've also included things that aren't monopodial, aren't single-stemmed, like clonal species and another kind of fig, the banyan fig. The banyan fig is a tree that walks through the sites where it occurs, in the sense that it has branches that send roots towards the soil that develop into supporting tissue, and the whole colony gets bigger. But if one end is dying and the other is expanding, the whole tree is just sort of in slow motion, walking like a slinky across the site. So anyway, those are not single stems, so they fall outside the monopodial circle. And then this adds the trees with secondary thickening with tree rings, which rules out palm trees and ferns and related monocots. So finally, the biggest circle is tall woody plants. So that's the broadest definition of tree. The narrowest is trees that are monopodial, self-supporting, and have secondary thickening. The idea of having meristems that supply perennial growth above ground was incorporated in an early classification of growth forms by Rancière, in which he called those tall plants in which the meristems are located from distance above the ground, the phanerophytes, as opposed to plants that have their growing points, the overwintering or through the dry season points in other zones, but not high off the ground. And he then divided those by height. So you can see the mega, meso, and micro phanerophytes. Many definitions of trees start at single stem plants that are at least 15 feet or 2 meters or 3 meters, somewhere in there. And that's the dashed line that separates trees from shrubs. Okay, so two patterns of tree diversity. What I want to talk about here is latitude, which is sort of a stand-in variable for current and past environments. And the number of tree species increases 10 or more fold, depending on the scale at which you look at this problem, from boreal to tropical environments. So latitude is one pattern of diversity. The other one, it's an even more interesting one, historic biogeography. And this is the idea that for any given environment, the actual number of tree species you find there depends specifically on the history and geography of that particular area. And I'm going to give you a big example of that in a minute. A recent paper estimated that there were 73,000 species of trees on Earth. It's an astounding number. 65,000 have been given scientific names, and most of the unnamed ones are in the tropics. Given the high diversity of tropical forests, some scientists have put the number of trees on Earth as over 100,000 species. The tropical rainforest comprises only 6% of the planet's forested area, but 75% of the planet's tree species. And this tropical tree diversity is really astounding, even at small scales, going from bigger to smaller here. Well, Amazon Basin, 11,000 tree species. In Borneo, more tree species than 1 square kilometer in Borneo than in all the temperate zone. And in 100 by 100 meter sample plots, 250 to 650 species recorded in tropical forest versus 25 to 50, even in our richest temperate forests. Okay, so latitude is a major variable in terms of diversity. And there are a number of theories about why that's true. It's one is that the environment produces better growing conditions in the tropics, in the wet tropics, and that anytime you move from those better conditions to places with cold or drought, you're increasing the adaptive cost to trees, and the number of species that evolve to fill those places are lower than in the tropics. That would be an environmental sort of theory. And there's some other theories too. One is that the north and south poles are the places with the greatest environmental fluctuation over time. So maybe fewer species evolve compared to the tropics. But the big one that I want to turn to now is the pattern 2, which is even when the environmental conditions are the same, roughly speaking, as they are for temperate deciduous forests. That's the kind of forest we live in. You can see that they're mapped here and then in Europe and then in East Asia. Even when you have places that are similar in terms of their ecology and their environment, and they're at similar latitudes, do they differ in diversity? And the answer to that is yes. So here's a picture of a wonderful beech forest in fall color. Looks just like a place in the Appalachians, but this is a photograph I took in Japan. Here are some leaves that should look familiar to you. The ones in yellow are so similar, I bet you could pick out the category, the genus, like walnut or basswood or elm or oaks, the maples. There are only 3, and I put them in red, that have sort of no parallel here in Eastern North America. This is a picture I took at a national park in China that was dominated by this, at lower elevation, forests were dominated by deciduous species. Well, to make a long story short, and a long story short in the sense also of a scientific question that was first posed in the 1700s by one of Linnaeus's students. Why were the plants arriving in Sweden from Siberia so similar to those arriving from North America? What shaped these distributions is that, well, first of all, let me give you the distribution. East Asia has more species within the deciduous forest than Eastern North America, which has more species than Europe. There are, for example, 110 species of maple in East Asia, compared to 11 in each of North America and Europe. Now, these trees are descended from common ancestors, but they're now so widely separated because of continental drift and past climate change. About 85 genera, including trees like magnolia, tulip tree, and sassafras, are now found as wild plants only in Eastern North America and half a world away in East Asia. Well, what you have to really think about, though, is that when these trees evolved and dominated the Earth, this is what the continents looked like. There was warm temperate forest across what is now from Alaska to Siberia. In general, the climate was warmer and wetter throughout the latitudes. And also there was a physical geographic connection over which seeds and gene flow could occur in what is now the North Atlantic. So as I said, this has left a pattern that's really interesting to us Eastern botanists, because the closest relatives of some of our plants are in China and nowhere in between. The upper map is just temperate forest, including coniferous forest, for example, in the Western US. The upper right graph, those symbols I know are probably a bit hard to read, but basically there are some species, some genera like maples that are found in every temperate forest zone, from the Pacific Northwest to the Eastern US to Europe, to parts of the Middle East, even in the mountains, and to Asia. So maples are found throughout that area. At the other extreme, tulip poplars, which are the bottom leaves, it's supposed to suggest the tulip poplar, are found only in East Asia and Eastern North America. And then there are several genera that are found at some intermediate spot between those. But the real extremes of disjunction, like magnolia and tulip tree in the lower left, and hickories in the lower right, are found only in these two places. Now, if you look at the fossil record, for example, for magnolia, you discover that magnolias were found in the Western US and in Europe and in East Asia prior to the Ice Age. Some Ice Age extinctions produced what have been called living fossils. The two examples, ginkgo and dawn redwood. So magnolia and tulip poplar are found just in Eastern North America and Eastern Asia, but used to occur at a wider area across the temperate zone. In this case, these two genera survived only in East Asia, even though they were known from the fossil record across the temperate zone. So the gray stippling in the upper part of the graph is, the upper graph is the original distribution of ginkgo, and the two little black arrows are where it survived in the wild during and after the ice ages. And then dawn redwood, similarly known across the continents as a fossil, but now only known from a single wild grove in China. They were discovered in the fossil record and described in the fossil record before these trees were found in the wild, hence the title Living Fossils. So again, making this long story short, similar environments, different diversities. Extinctions were much higher during the Ice Age in Europe compared to Eastern North America, and they were least of all in East Asia. So if you look at the percentage of the genera known from the fossil record that are still present in these areas, Eastern Asia has the highest fraction of those compared to the other areas. The Ice Age was much less severe in Asia, but also maybe owing to the great latitudinal longitude range of mountainous area in the map in the lower right in Asia compared to even North America, much more speciation as well. Okay, so let me try to summarize those thoughts. So the first pattern is the pattern of diversity with latitude. The second pattern is even at a given latitude, are there differences in diversity? And as I showed, the answer to that is yes. And also that those differences are explained by historic events and the geography of the continents as well. Okay, all right. So the last thing I wanted to do was to give you some examples of roles and personalities of trees. So I imagined if I took parts of a tree and I just thought of, well, what's a good actual thing you could observe in the woods around Chapel Hill? What would it be? And the first I wanted to describe has to do with the design of leaves. We probably take for granted that leaves come in all different shapes and sizes, and some are compound and some are lobed. Actually, this diversity of leaf shapes reaches its highest point in the temperate zone compared to the tropics and compared to the boreal forest. The lower right-hand picture is from Panama, and the leaves there often converge on a single form, a kind of an elliptic leaf with a long point called a drip tip that allows water to drip off the leaf, and therefore, if it accumulated on the leaf, it would lead to fungal populations on the leaf surface. So the dark green evergreen leaves, often converging on a very simple shape, are characteristic of the tropics. But if we look at these characteristics in the lower left, the amount of teeth along the edge of the leaf increases 15-fold as we go from the tropics to the boreal zone. The leaves are more lobed and divided as we go away from the tropics. The perimeter to area ratio also goes up, so leaves are more divided. And on the other hand, the size of leaves and broad-leaved evergreen species with thick dark green leaves, as you can see in the lower right, increase as we go towards the tropics. So that's your leaf story. Here's some data on that. This is the, in the left, the mean annual temperature. On the bottom axis, the proportion of species with entire leaves, that is no teeth. And you can see that as you go in North America from north to south, you're going from the left-hand graph, you're going from the lower left to the upper right, and leaves are becoming much more entire as you get to warm environments. So the subtropics in Florida have leaves without teeth along, as many teeth along the edge is the overview of that. Now, all botanists love this quote from Darwin. I'm strongly induced to believe that as in music, the person who understands every note will, if he also possesses a proper taste, more thoroughly enjoy the whole. So he who examines each part of a fine view may also thoroughly comprehend the full and combined effect. Hence, a traveler should be a botanist, for in all views, plants form the chief embellishment. So that's your encouragement to get to know the shape, sizes, and margins of leaves. My second observation is of stems. This was a fun one to write about in the book. The graph on the left is actually from Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo da Vinci made an interesting prediction. He said that the diameter of a tree at the base is equal to the diameter of the tree at any distance from the base. So what did he mean by that? He meant that imagine a set of garden hoses in a bundle, and that after you get to about 10 feet, divide that bundle into two, and then go another few feet and divide it again into two, and again into two, until each branch is just a single hose. Well, that what Leonardo da Vinci was trying to say was that the diameter, the sum diameter of the hoses is always the same. You have the same hoses at the tip of the divisions than you do at the base. And that was his drawing predicting, you know, if you collected all the branches and twigs of a tree and pushed them together, they'd be the same diameter at the base. It turns out to be approximately true. The summed area at a distance tends to be higher than the amount of wood or the diameter at the base. But it's roughly true. And this led to something called Corner's rules. The three trees diagrammatically on the right are trees with different amounts of branching. And Corner's rule states that the larger the appendage, in this case, the leaf, the stouter the stem on which it's borne, and the fewer the branches at a given total leaf area. So in other words, trees range from small leaved, many branched to big leaved, few branched. I did some research on this myself, and it was a really fun project to get involved in. Here's some extremes. So on the left, you have devil's walking stick. All that green area of leaf is made up of large compound leaves, divided leaves. And the leaves can be a meter long. The leaves, though, are deciduous, and when they fall, they leave those almost barren sticks, hence the common name devil's walking stick, because it looks like a walking stick and it has thorns. Eventually, the terminal bud produces an inflorescence at the tip of a devil's walking stick, and from then on, it branches sideways, but it still has this stout branches and few branches. Each of the leaflets of a devil's walking stick is about the size of a flowering dogwood leaf. So I'm comparing that to a flowering dogwood in winter, in which you can see the vast number of twigs needed to support. You know, if we did the observation correctly, what we'd want to hold is the total amount of leaf area the same, varying from big leaves on one hand to small leaves. But you can see, you can get the idea that consequences of leaf size for branching pattern. True in pines too. The longleaf pine has the longest leaves, longest needles, the stoutest branches, and the fewest branches in its tree crown compared to, for example, a short needled pine like Virginia pine. Okay, that was stems. Here's your bark observation. So these are profiles of different species that range from species that have thin bark, and in the upper left, believe that's red maple. And in the bottom, the other extreme, species with thick bark, and I believe that is, it's blackjack oak. So what's interesting about the differences in bark thickness is that bark provides insulation for the living inner tissues of the stem from fire. So in fire-prone areas, their trees are often adapted to have very thick bark. But notice that the blackjack oak allocates more bark to the bottom of the tree than further up the trunk. And that's because the usual exposure of flames is near the ground. So you can have bark that is even thicker. For example, in the fire-prone giant sequoia groves, the sequoia bark can be 3/4 of a meter thick on the trunk. Now, I think bark is underappreciated. It's a barrier for fungi, insects, mammalian herbivores. It's very low in nutrients. What animal wants to chew through all of that fibrous, high carbon, low nitrogen tissue on the stem? It's a protection against desiccation and fire, temperature flux, mechanical injury. And it's a mechanical barrier, but also often a chemical barrier. And so I think it's, underused by botanists because of a couple of factors. One is that the bark of a particular kind of tree changes with the age of the tree, sometimes quite dramatically. And the other is it's just plain hard to describe. Some barks are pretty easy to describe, but many are complicated ridges and intersecting patterns of that outer bark tissue and difficult, as I say, to describe and include in a key. Although I did see on the web that there's a artificial intelligence project in which a computer is looking through pictures of bark that have been labeled to species and coming up with a kind of give us a picture and we'll match it to something and bypass the whole description problem. And that's the thickness of bark relative to various insults that the tree may experience, like fire, is well known and much researched. Here's one that, I just, I like to make pictures of leaves on the ground. The other thing I stopped the car for is pictures of sycamore in November when the upper white trunks are displayed against the gray of the woods. But I include this because we don't know why the sycamore has this kind of bark, this jigsaw puzzle-like bark. Again, there are theories, and you missed my, if you had come to me earlier, I wouldn't have been retired, and you could have had a wonderful PhD project figuring out why the sycamore has its bark. Now you have to find another major professor. There are some theories. My favorite theory is that this modeling of color relates to the exposure of caterpillars crawling up the trunk to bird predation. So insects, many species of insects live on tree barks, and you also use it as the way of getting towards the leaves that they're seeking to infest. It would be hard to camouflage yourself against all these different colors. And therefore, again, my favorite theory these days is that it exposes insects to predation. There's a little bit of evidence out there that this kind of thing happens. There are the famous experiments in Britain in which caterpillars were tied by little threads to tree bark. And I guess it was the moth form, not the caterpillar form, but and it was shown that the dark colored moths had less predation on dark colored trees, and the light colored moths had less predation on lichen covered trunks that were light gray. So if we have all these different colors, maybe that, like I say, that remains to be seen. My root example has to do with a really wonderful little microhabitat we have around us, which I call walnut glades. So as you're walking through these woods, this is in Carolina North, you're seeing a glimpse of what looks like an oasis in the background of a very different understory. If you get closer to it, you notice that it's, well, this season anyway, that those microstegium grasses and a few composites and a few taller grasses have greened the forest floor, unlike anything else in the surrounding forest. There are those composites that also live here. Well, if you look above you, you'll see that those are places dominated by walnut trees. And in particular, farmers love to have walnut trees around, and sometimes they actually grew them in nut orchards. And you can see here that some trees are in lines that are remnants of how they were planted by the farmer in the upper right picture. So it's known that walnuts exude chemicals from the root system, which influence the germination and growth of other species of plants. Some plants seem tolerant, as you see, but it creates a completely different understory in that one grove compared to the right surrounding forest. These walnut glades occur at many different places, including Brumley Forest. Keep an eye out for the dominance of walnut and what it does to the understory. Now, for the root example, I could have used something about talking trees, since that's all in the news. And I think maybe this chemical change affects the mycorrhizae that live on the roots of other plants as well. Maybe not just the direct effect on those plants, but maybe that's through changing the fungal environment as well. My last category is seeds. Thoreau said, he was talking to a neighbor, a farmer, who claimed that there was spontaneous generation in his compost pile. And Thoreau said, I do not believe a plant will spring up where no seed has been. I have great faith in the seed, convinced me of a seed there, and I'm prepared to expect wonders. And maybe a great example of that is the pinhead seed of the giant sequoia, which will increase 50 billion times in mass as it reaches the stage of those giant trees. Well, my seed example is bike lane botany. So I commuted on a bike to the garden for 20 some years. And I began to look down where I was rolling along and seeing interesting things. And one of them was the botany of the bike lane. I actually developed a talk for the volunteers here called Botany of the Bike Lane. But this is one aspect of it. And that is, we have a number of early blooming trees, many of them used as street trees between here and Carborough, but they're normally on stream sides. They produce, they flower in February sometimes, and certainly by early March. Some elms, also the silver maple, and they produce something that's really odd and unusual for our landscape, which is non-dormant seeds. These seeds are produced by that year's flowering in the spring, and as they mature and fall from the tree, they're ready to germinate. In fact, they must germinate sometimes within just a few weeks, or that seed dies. They're plump, they're full of moisture, they're ready to go. I think it's because blooming in late winter and getting ready to colonize mud banks along a stream, if that's your habitat, it's what you want to do is get established quickly and get a root system down before the next flood. So that's my seed example. I could have used some others. The pin or fire cherry, which occurs in the mountains of North Carolina, is the opposite extreme in the sense that it has very long dormancy in its seeds. The seeds are known to last a century or more in the soil. If you were to dig up some of the soil and expose it to the right triggers for germination, you could have a colony of pin cherry. And in fact, that's what happens after fire, hence the name fire cherry. But it also occurs after other disturbances to the forest. So a great range of dormancy from 0 to here long-lived. So is there a summary for this talk? I guess, to me, what I've tried to illustrate is that within the notion of tree, there are endless forms and, you know, kinds of leaves, shapes, barks, branching patterns, biological interactions, and life histories. We'll also include PD again in this summary. Wherever you live, wherever you tramp or travel, the trees are wondrously companionable if you have a speaking acquaintance with them. When you have learned their names, they say them back to you as you encounter them, and very much more, for they speak of your own past and experience among them. So I won't go through this whole slide. It's, you know, trees are important for many reasons, both because we use them, but also because of the ecosystem services they provide and the psychological and spiritual benefits from having nature and trees in our landscape. So, you know, one hope I have for the book is that it's a kind of benchmark for trees and forests of this variety of what trees are, why they're important and what they do. And obviously, as a former director of this place, you can't really end any speech without noting that we need support to accomplish these things. All righty. Okay. So comments, questions?
Peter, thank you so much. That was really beautiful. And I particularly liked the closing quote myself. So thank you for that. We have just a few minutes for some questions from the audience. I know we have at least one online. David, do we have a hand in the room? Yes.
Thank you, Peter. I had heard about the toxicity of walnuts before. I had an experience where we had collected a bunch of walnut nuts still in the green husks, and I thought I would hang them from a tree in a hardware cloth bag until that green stuff on the outside had washed away. The tree died. I'm wondering if that's part of the same phenomenon.
Yeah, sounds like it. I mean, we need to do the fuller experiment, but yeah, it's pretty potent. It also has been tested against a whole variety of crop plants, and you know, because yeah, so.
All right, this question came in response to one of your earlier slides saying that smaller seeds come from trees that have or are faster growing. But this person's asking, what about sweet gums? They have tons of small seeds. They're opportunistic and fast growing, but they can also be long lived.
Yeah, so do a spectrum of trees that there's this sort of middle ground where trees can be fast growing but long lived. And actually white pine is an example of that from the Northeast. Liriodendron is another one that is a fast grower and colonized disturbance patches, but also has, you know, several 100-year or more lifespan. So yeah, it's a curious pattern. It's the one exception to those general rules, and I don't know an explanation for it. But there are trees in every environment that seem to fit that particular category. Yeah. Another question.
I believe we have one more question here. Hold on one second.
Okay. I'm wondering if you could speak to leaves versus needles, because I think of leaves as being more sensible, but needles must have a very good use.
So what's the question again? The distinction or?
The choice between what is good about a needle form instead of a leaf form.
Right. Yeah, so the other explanation for having small-leaved evergreens is in acidic soils where nutrients are low, because as the tree absorbs nutrients and invests those in leaves, if the leaves live several seasons, then it's a slower recycling and a slower exposure of those nutrients to loss after they fall from the tree. So both broad-leaved, small-leaved trees and needle-leaved trees include many that are found on acid soils. But yeah, when you go in that latitudinal gradient, you have high broad-leafed evergreenness in the tropics. You have, say, a mesic, a moist, temperate forest without evergreens, maybe just one or two species like American holly. And then you go to the boreal forest where the dominance is by needle-leaved evergreen trees. Yeah, so it's not just the evergreenness, but also the size of the leaves that matters. And I think what distinguishes the temperate mesic forest is that if you can rapidly deploy leaves from a leaf-bare winter, and conditions are good for productivity, it's better to be deciduous than to have long-lasting leaves, since there's so much of the year is not a part of the growing season. But you get evergreens both where the growing season is shorter or the soil's more acidic or the conditions are drier, as well as towards the tropics. And there the difference would be not evergreenness per se, but leaf size. So.
So we'd love to have much more time with you, Peter. It's time for us to close in here. And for those who are with us in person, please join us in the exhibit hall. We have a reception and opportunity if you're interested in buying the book in the garden shop and have Peter sign it. You're welcome to join him in there if you have more questions here as well. And please join me again in thanking Peter for being here with us.